Climbing at a sea cliff is a fantastic experience with loads of adventure. But before we even get to the crag, there's a few things that we can do just to check to make sure that we can be at the crag and make sure there's no restrictions. First thing you need to know is where do you find information about the access at the crag? And we can do that by checking the BMC RAD app or Regional Access Database, and that lists all the information about the crags around the UK and any restrictions that you might find. The types of restrictions that you can get at a crag would be things like bird bans, landowner restrictions and military restrictions. Bird bans generally are quite seasonal, and sea cliffs are an amazing place, amazing habitat for wild birds and protected birds. So it's important that we don't upset any of those birds during nesting times. So by checking the RAD app, it will tell us the type of birds that are nesting there and any restrictions on the crag. Some of those restrictions will come in either a partial restriction, where they'll block off a certain area of the crag. For example, Stanage has got a partial restriction at certain times of year for ring ouzels. And then other crags, they'll have a full ban on the crag, which is normally reserved for the smaller areas where there's lots of birds like puffins, guillemots and razorbills and those sort of birds. And there's nothing worse than questing into a breeding puffin's nest in nesting season, so you want to try and stay away from that. Next up is military restrictions, generally certain times throughout the year. So if you're going to go down to somewhere like Pembrokeshire, you'll have areas where they restrict the crags at certain times of the day. And some ranges as well have briefings that you have to attend at the military base in order to know all the details about how not to end up on a crag when there's bullets cracking around, because climbing can be quite stressful as it is without military ordnance firing around you. So making sure that you know about any of those restrictions as well. And the final one is landowner restrictions, and that doesn't apply as much to the sea cliffs, but UK-wide, making sure that we follow any of the restrictions or any of the recommendations by the access teams. And that could be things like no loud music, no groups, no barbecues and no fires at the crag, because these can often affect our impact our access to the crags and stop us from having any future access at the crags. Once you've checked the access at the crag and found out whether you can actually climb there or not, the next thing is tide times. We can go into a lot of detail about tides, but let's just keep it simple. So we've got high tide and low tide. And generally, if you check the Regional Access Database or Google tide times for the area that you're going, you'll be able to see that there's normally 4 tides throughout the day. There'll be 2 high tides and 2 low tides. So making sure that we don't climb on a tide-affected crag or a ledge that's low to the sea level on a high tide ensures that you don't get wet legs or your belay gets wet legs. And sometimes it can completely restrict the access to the crag by the fact that the waves are washing up against the rock and make it unclimbable. Low tides are better for tide-affected crags, so making sure you try and find the time when the tide's at the lowest point to give you plenty of time for you and your partner to get up to the top of the crag, especially on those longer pitches at 50 metres or so where you're going to be belaying for quite some time. So now we know about the access, we know about the tide times and everything's sort of falling into place. Next we need to know about how we get to the start of the route. And unlike mountain routes, we're starting from the very top of the crag, so we've got to get down there in the first place to start climbing. And sometimes this can actually be where the highest risk is, because we often end up down climbing sections of pretty loose or scrambly terrain. So it's worth thinking about the way you're going to approach the crag and whether you do that in rock shoes or some sort of fell shoes or running shoes so you've got more grip. And also whether you're going to abseil in or not. Now, if it's a walk down, just consider your own personal safety. Often taking trainers with you and then at the bottom clipping them onto the back of your harness just means you get more grip on the approach. But if it's a more rocky down climb type approach, then going down in your rock shoes would be more appropriate. If it's a route or a crag where you're going to be doing multiple climbs on the same day, and it's quite a short crag like this place where we're at today, you might want to consider setting up an abseil rope and just making sure you don't abseil down something like a classic route or making sure you don't abseil down something that's popular. So try and pick an area where it's quiet or somewhere where there's no traffic. When you decided which method that you're going to use, whether it's abseiling or down climbing, it's good to have a conversation with your climbing partner just to make sure they're happy with the method that you've chosen, as they might not be competent at abseiling or they might not be quite happy abseiling. So picking a method that suits both of you and your abilities is the most suitable and the most useful way to get down to the bottom of the crag. Next, we need to think about the sort of grades that are at the crag. So imagine you're, say, a severe or hard severe climber and you're abbing into a route, not down climbing, but you're going to ab in, and the easiest route at that crag is the sort of hardest grade you can climb. So we need to consider about whether we can actually climb out of that route and whether the route's dry. And if we can't climb the route because for whatever reason it's wet or out of condition or we're not up to the challenge, we need the ability or the skill to be able to get back up the abseil rope. So doing a course or doing some extra education on how to ascend a rope if you're going to do that sort of adventurous climbing is definitely a skill you need to get into the toolbox. And if you haven't got those skills or you're not as confident, making sure you pick crags that are approachable by walking or down climbing as opposed to abseiling in. And you can find information about the BMC RAD app by just clicking the link just over here.